Hi, I'm Oliver, and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. Happy New Year! I've missed this so much. I'm grinning because I've missed making videos on this channel. I've had a month off because I've had so much work to do, university work, research papers, all sorts of things, but I am back and it feels good. Unfortunately, videos from now on until April are going to be a little bit more sporadic at times because I've got so much dissertation work to do, I've got exams to do, things like that, and I could try and push out a video or two a week, but I feel like the quality would drop quite drastically because I wouldn't have time to write the stuff and it would just end up being a bit shit. So I'd rather put out stuff as and when I can and hopefully remain at a similar quality that you guys are happy with watching. Nevertheless, there's lots of exciting things in the pipeline for Deep Cuts this year. We've got lots more Guide to videos. I'm going to try and get out more this year than I did last year. I'm going to do a guide to Ortega, Tom Waits, maybe Doom. So watch this space. So today I'm going to do 5 pieces to get you into 20th century classical music. To start off with this video, I tried to pick 5 pieces from the entire history of classical music from the 15th century all the way up to now, and it was the most ridiculous thing. I don't even know why I wasted my time trying to do that. So I had to try and pare it down a little bit. So as such, I'm doing 20th century. I'm going to talk about 20th century pieces, and at some point I will tackle other periods such as the Renaissance period, and maybe we'll look at the Baroque period. We'll look at the more experimental avant-garde minimalist side of the 20th century. I'll break them down because otherwise it's too much and it's impossible to pare them down to 5 specific pieces. A little bit of housekeeping first before I get into the list. I've committed the cardinal sin of using the term classical because there's a period of music defined as the classical period as much as there's a period defined as the Renaissance, the Baroque period, and as such the term classical's become an umbrella term for anything that's orchestral, an opera, a symphony, anything that really isn't kind of contemporary music that's jazz, blues, rock, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit of a problematic term, so I will use the term classical, but we'll both understand the problematized notion of that term itself. I approach this list with a simple goal: pick 5 pieces that are going to blow your socks off and want you to experience more music in this vein. That's the idea. Hopefully there'll be a lot of you coming to this video that have never listened to a proper symphony start to finish before. You'll listen to one of these and you'll think, wow, what have I been missing out on? So that was my approach when looking at these pieces. As such, some of you might think there are a few obvious pieces in this list. I mean, yeah, that's the point. There are a couple of really obvious ones, and maybe one or two not so much. But the point is that hopefully you guys will listen to this and really appreciate this music, and it'll open up a whole new world of music for you to get stuck into. I think you'll all love these pieces if you take the time out to listen to them. I really do. Number 1, Jean Sibelius with his Symphony 5 in E-flat major. Kicking this off with an absolute fecking belter. Jean Sibelius was a Swedish composer. He was born in 1865 and died in 1957. Really good innings, actually. Keep his name in mind if you're planning on delving into orchestral and classical works more, because he has a very impressive body of work. Symphony No. 5 is a 3-movement symphony. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, a symphony is the umbrella term for multiple movement compositions for orchestras, quite large orchestras, so you have brass, woodwind, percussion, strings. It was really difficult to pick a Sibelius symphony. I knew I wanted one in there, but I had to go with No. 5 due to its majesty and its impact too. Composed first in 1915 and then finally completed in 1919, some critics have described this as one of the greatest symphonic works of the 20th century. It's a vibrant journey that feels somehow light and airy, but it also has this heft to it. The first movement of the piece really takes its time. We get these slow timpani rolls, we get fluttering strings and flutes cushioned by bassoon and trombone. As it builds, however, the piece begins to get faster and it really builds up to this proper momentum and then reaches a tonal shift halfway through, which all of a sudden makes it feel a lot more tense. You have this element of panic in the agitated strings and these semitonal melodies. When it finally resolves into this glorious sunlight, you will know, because it's so apparent in the music and it's such a stirring, dramatic moment. It feels like a finale, but this is only the first movement. The second movement is actually more indicative of the first part of the first movement, so it's a little bit more restrained, it's quite slow. You have the tonal blend of the tension in the strings, but also swooning melodies, and the whole thing is almost entirely absent of timpani, which again just lifts that middle section. So the final movement, wow, wow, wow. So any fans of Godspeed watching? Fans of the old post-rock crescendo that builds and builds to that cathartic climax? Well, You ain't heard nothing yet. The final movement of Sibelius' Fifth is spellbinding. It's the musical equivalent of a sweeping vista that just knocks you over again and again, and you wonder if it'll ever lessen, the impact will ever lessen, but it just never does. The gorgeous heart-swelling melody in the horn section gives way to this huge cadence, and you think, well, this is the end, but it's not. It just keeps building. It keeps building up your expectations and then knocking them down by continuing to create this massive thrumming crescendo, and you end up thinking, how the hell is this payoff ever going to live up to the crescendo, to the build-up that Sibelius has created in this music? Well, Sibelius actually makes you feel like a right twonk, because as he's building up, he reaches this moment and then the entire orchestra just cuts to silence, and you think, well, that's the end. And then he resolves it in the chords with a stab from the entire orchestra, and then another one, and then another one. He's playing with the silence, and it's just a brilliant sort of playful way to end this piece that is so majestic and fun as well. So good. Number 2, Gustav Holst with The Planets. Very well-known piece, and to be honest, I just couldn't leave it out of this list. Gustav Theodor Holst was born in 1874 and died in 1934. An English composer who composed one of the most famous, well-known pieces of all time, The Planets. So we got ourselves a concept piece here. It's an astrological theme relating to the planets and their effect on the human psyche. The fact of each movement representing a planet and its psychological attributes makes this probably the most immediate piece of work on the entire list. Apparently Holst was actually pretty fed up of the planet's success, because it was the only thing that anybody ever talked about, and he'd written so much other really good music, and it was never really discussed because the Planet Suite is so damn good. And it's not difficult to see why though, because in these 7 movements of dramatic, gorgeous music, you have an irresistible concept as well that ties the entire thing together. It conceptualizes orchestral music in an almost cinematic way, and I think that's why it's got such a lasting power even now. This time we're dealing with a bigger orchestra than Sibelius' Fifth, and that's really demonstrated in the shaking opening movement, Mars, the bringer of war. And this 5/4 time signature is utilised in this marching rhythm that embodies the idea of approaching war and violence so well. The orchestra creates this brilliant driving rhythm, and it's just duh, diddle, duh, 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 duh. It's very ominous, heavily inspiring John Williams for his Star Wars score. I mean, it's so apparent when you listen to especially this movement of the planets. You can't help but visualize this great battle taking place, great swoops giving way to staccato horn motifs and brash percussion. It's not all like this though, and I think again some of the lasting love for this piece is all about the diversity of its tone, the dynamism of the different movements. The second movement, Venus, the Bringer of Peace, is, as the title suggests, a much more comforting celestial piece than the Bringer of War. And it's celestial because the space created in the composition to allow these harp tones to ring out into the ether. Again, much of this success is in the sequencing as well, that the gentility after that rousing impact of the first movement just creates a wonderful contrast between these two planets, these two psychological ideas that are embodied in our response to the planets. The third movement, Mercury the Winged Messenger, is a little bit more fluid, kind of mischievous in its restless instrumental lines, and I think it's a great successor to Venus because it's preparing you for the central movement of this piece, Jupiter, the Bringer of Jollity. This movement might be one you've heard of before. It has so much dynamism in itself as a movement, so we have an upbeat and rousing piece that gives way to this beautiful, and I really do mean beautiful, central motif. This section is something that you might recognise because it was adapted into the hymn I Vow to Thee My Country, and it's one of those sections of music that always sends a chill down my spine every single time I listen to it, unless it's a recording I really don't like of the section. I'm quite picky about it, but basically every single time I listen to it I get that chill down my back because it is such a wonderful section of music. I really think you'll all love it when you listen to it. It's just all encompassing, and on the final repeat of that motif it feels like your heart may well burst out of your chest. Saturn, the Bringer of Old Age, is more cautious and plodding, suggested by the title itself, and again it just feels like a moment of introspection after that very gorgeous and rousing Jupiter. Uranus the Magician twists unexpectedly. It kind of throws you off balance and leaves you hanging in each part of the piece, like I suppose a magician would with a trick. See how these titles really play into the dynamism and also the approach to the musical composition that Holst took. Finale Neptune the Mystic includes an additional chorus of female vocalists, and their hypnotic harmonies, for me, encapsulate the wondrous abyss of space more than any other moment in this entire piece. It's a beautiful ending to this journey that you've gone on. Could probably talk about this piece for an hour, to be honest. Put some headphones on and go on a journey with this. Number 3, Arvo Pärt, Cantus in memory of Benjamin Britten. This is the smallest piece I'm going to talk about today. This is a single movement that lasts around 5 minutes long, but I really wanted you all to check this out. A much later piece than the Planets and Sibelius Symphony 5, Cantus in memory of Benjamin Britten was composed in 1977 by the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt. As far as mournful elegiac music goes, I challenge you to find a piece of music more devastatingly sad and haunting as this one. Not only the shortest piece I'm talking about, but also the simplest from a compositional standpoint. Pärt composed the entire thing in A minor, and the instrumental lines just repeatedly descend down the A minor scale, and it's a way that kind of replicates this insistent, all-encompassing despair. Much of Pärt's compositional style is based on chant music, or more specifically Gregorian chant music, so the repetition feels like this kind of persistent incantation. If you ever get the chance to check out Gregorian chant music, an entire world of hypnotic, strange music awaits you. Pärt went all in on this piece. He begins with a single tubular bell sound that chimes through the darkness and continues to be struck throughout. And it echoes through the darkness and the replete sadness of this piece of music. That central sound is what makes it feel so funereal. And on top of that, you have the weeping strings. Oh, the strings. The ending of the piece doubles down on the bass part slowly, so we start getting a piece of music that becomes even more despairing as it reaches its conclusion, and then everything just cuts out, and the resonance and the overtone resonance of the tubular bell is the only thing that's crying out into the darkness. Apparently on the score itself, Pärt noted the piece should begin in silence and end in silence, and the whole thing is like a meditation or a reflection on the beauty and the fragility of life, and also the respect that we should pay living in this world for the brief time that we do. A very haunting yet wonderful piece of music. Listen. Number 4, Gustav Mahler with Symphony No. 5 in C-sharp minor. Another No. 5 symphony, oh, and another Gustav as well, so this time from the Austrian composer Gustav Mahler. Okay, so Mahler died in 1911, and much of his style of music is considered to be late romantic, so, I hear you ask, maybe, why have I included him in my list of 20th century classical pieces? Well, Mahler did write this in 1902, but aside from just about fitting into my century bracket, he was a fierce supporter of the Second Viennese School of Composition, and that birthed composers like Schoenberg, groundbreaking composers who were doing things that no one else was doing, and people were decrying them for it. But Mahler didn't. Mahler was a staunch supporter of what they were doing, and I think that shows the forward-thinking approach that he had and who he was as a musician. And also I think there's something quite forward-thinking about this piece as you listen to it. Famously, the first time it was performed, Mahler felt disappointed. He said that if it had been performed 50 years later, it would have had a much greater impact. One of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this piece today is its sense of scale. Aside from being over an hour long, the approach to each movement has a synergy to it that when you take the entire piece into account, it just feels massive. Mahler utilised something called progressive tonality throughout this piece. So there are 5 movements to this. He started with C-sharp minor in the first movement. We then moved to A minor in the second movement, D major for the third movement, F major for the fourth movement, and then back to D major again for the final 5th movement. This provides a resolution to the conflict that kind of just knocks the wind right out of you. By resolving in D major, it makes you feel as if you're galloping towards this barn-burning conclusion, and it's such a far cry away from the somber beginnings of the first movement that you experienced over an hour ago at this point. Please don't let the length of the piece put you off. I was just going to talk about the finale because I think it's just such a fantastic single movement. But I feel like if you really want to get into classical music and orchestral music, you need to be able to take time to sit down and appreciate a work in the way it was intended by the composer. Which is why I really think a grand sense of scale when bringing all these movements together will truly help you to appreciate, if you don't already, the complexity and the complex emotion that can come out of these massive works. Another reason for the complexity of the composition is Mahler's use of counterpoint throughout much of this symphony. So the counterpoint is the process where different instrumental lines, or voices as they're sometimes known, between themselves have a harmony, but they're very different rhythmically. It's actually something that someone like Bach was really well known for doing, and by utilizing counterpoint, Mahler is showing some of his influences. He loved Bach's work, and he's just showing that off here in certain moments between certain voices within his compositions. You can really hear that being utilized in the second movement of the piece, for example. It has a very theatrical, lofty feel to the music, and these gorgeous melodic lines are taking place in the lower registers just as much as they are in the higher registers, and there's these plucked violin strings, which are also known as pizzicato. That's when you pluck a string, and that adds to the texture of the movement. Because you've got all these different melodic lines in different sections of the music, it just feels very all-encompassing as you're listening to it. I alluded to that finale, and to be honest, it's up there with the finale of the Sibelius piece I talked about at the beginning, but it feels all the more breakneck in its pace because of that progressive tonality that has taken place throughout the entire piece. Timpani and cymbals are utilised here to create this crashing, belligerent full stop on this staggering piece of music. Go and have a listen to it. Number 5, Igor Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring. Stravinsky was a Russian composer, born in 1882 and died in 1971. A very influential composer, and probably the first composer that really helped me appreciate the true transgressive qualities of classical and orchestral music. And it's, probably when I was a kid I thought it was all doilies and old people sitting around listening to stuff that didn't interest me, basically. And I think, yeah, someone like Stravinsky really hammered in the notion that that is a load of crap, and this music is unbelievable. Considered one of, if not the most influential composer of the 20th century, Stravinsky took the form of ballet and, for lack of a better word, he updated it. Actually, that's not the right word at all. He threw it at a wall, he covered it in neon paint, and then he skewered it with his conducting baton. Maybe. The weirdest analogy I've ever done on this whole channel. The Rite of Spring is considered one of the most important pieces of all time, and I think when you start listening to this piece, it will be very clear to you why that is. Stravinsky took compositional techniques not commonly utilised and used them to construct this monolithic ballet. Things like dissonance, which created this real palpable tension amongst the instrumental lines, or stress and accents on certain instruments that imbue the instrumental lines with this kind of unpredictable strength that goes throughout the entire piece. The first time this piece was ever performed, famously it caused an almost riot in the audience. It was that avant-garde and progressive for its time. Just imagine any kind of music having that level of impact in the 21st century. There's so much literature you can read about the Rite of Spring and Stravinsky himself, and I implore you to go and study him if you enjoy this piece of music on a first listen. Before you know it, you'll be listening along and air conducting as if you're on day release. Believe me, I'm so glad I'm not on camera when I'm listening to a piece like The Rite of Spring. Stravinsky himself described the music like this: a musical choreographic work representing pagan Russia, unified by a single idea, the mystery and great surge of the creative power of spring. Whilst of course this is a ballet, the onstage choreography stuff is important to understand the piece as an entire work of art. But what's so great about The Rite of Spring is because of the dynamism of the piece, it works perfectly well as its standalone concert piece, and it's often performed without the physical ballet stuff. So I don't feel like you lose out too much on it. So don't feel as if you're missing out if you decide to just listen to this piece. But also, if you do really take an interest in this, then try and track down a performance of it online. There'll be loads of stuff on YouTube. In fact, I'll try and provide a link in the description if I can find a good recording of one. I'm not going to go into this piece too much because quite frankly I don't know where to start. It's a complete work of genius and there's so much to it. The thundering timpani and crashing phrases and almost every instrumental line throughout this ballet make you feel like you're trapped in a tornado. You're fighting for your life the entire time, and just as you think everything's simmering down to this beautiful phrase that would be very melodic, all of a sudden this slight dissonance will be introduced, and all of a sudden it catches you off guard and it increases the tension again before ramming home with these accents within these instrumental lines. And it's so dramatic. It's a real behemoth of a piece of music. And to be honest, if you're only going to listen to one piece of music or one full symphony throughout these 5, then maybe this should be the one. Please go and experience this fiery, groundbreaking piece of music. It's 35 minutes of your life, and it's not very long time to experience something as wonderful as this. So just do it. And that's my 5 pieces to get you into 20th century classical music. I really love all the pieces on this, and I hope my enthusiasm for these pieces will implore you to go and check them out yourselves and appreciate them, because I really do think that they are an eye-opener. On the Deep Cuts Discord tomorrow at 10 PM GMT, we're going to be doing a listen through of a couple of these different pieces. I'll be there. There'll be a lot of first time listeners, so there'll be lots of things to discuss, first time impressions, things like that. That's always really good fun to do though, so come along, there's an invite in the description. Thanks for watching. It feels amazing that we're here with Deep Cuts in 2018, and I'll be back next week with a Deep Cuts Essential. Until then.